Today on the Bourbon Bytes podcast, we're keeping the news train rolling with tons of new whiskey releases for 2025, including the new Maker's Mark Cellar Aged release, High West's first bottle and bond bourbon, and Penelope's new estate collection. Plus, I'm reviewing the 2025 release of High West Distillery's Bourye whiskey. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Bourbon Bytes podcast. I'm your host, Clifton, and this is the week of Thursday, August 28th, 2025. And do I have a show for you today? Right off the heels of last week's episode with a bunch of limited edition bourbon announcements, we have even more to talk about this week. And this is to be expected as we get closer to fall. That seems to be the season where all these new releases come out. There's so much to keep up with, and I just want to make sure to give you guys the highlights as soon as I find out about them. Whether or not we get to try them on the podcast or the YouTube channel, that just depends on, one, if I can find them on the shelves, two, if brands want to send me a sample for review, contact@bourbonbytes.com, or if friends are generous enough to let me try a sample from their bottles. But today we do have a fun limited edition review of High West Bourye. I'm looking forward to getting into that with you guys for this week's bite-sized review. But first, we got to get through some news stories that I think you should know about. I know I'm not the only one excited about this LE season, as we call it, in bourbon and whiskey. But especially for me this year, one of the commitments I made for the channel and the podcast this year is I was going to make sure to try some limited editions that I normally would, maybe miss just because they're high price or harder to get. But this year is all about finding them and giving you guys my honest thoughts on them. I've done quite a few already, but hopefully some of the ones I talk about in this week's podcast, we get to try in the near future. So stay tuned. Make sure to subscribe on YouTube and follow me on your favorite podcast platform to be notified whenever I get a chance to try and review these upcoming releases. Putting it out into the universe now. Just come on, bring on the releases. The first new release I want to talk about today is Maker's Mark's Cellar Aged Bourbon is back in 2025. So they started this back in 2023 originally, and they basically are blending together some of their bourbon that has been aged at least half of their maturation cycles in Maker's Mark's limestone cellar, as opposed to the usual rickhouses where they spend most of their aging. And this is a pretty rare process in whiskey. We see cellar aging a lot with wine, but they are experimenting with it, and it seems to be a really successful collection. I did have a chance to try one of the previous releases and thought it was a unique take on Maker's Mark. But this year they are blending an 11, a 13, and a 14-year-old whiskey to make the Maker's Mark Cellar Aged 2025 release. That's some really highly aged Maker's Mark. As you remember, Maker's Mark doesn't typically do age statements on their standard releases. It's relatively new for them to be doing it. So for them to be blending some of this oldest whiskey that Maker's Mark has ever produced into a release is really, really cool. Now, this is going to be bottled at 56.45% or 112.9 proof. I'm assuming that's cask strength. I don't see it labeled as cask strength here, but I think previous releases have been considered cask strength as well. And it's going to be available first at the Maker's Mark gift shop. They're having a few bottles available before anyone else in the country can get it. So if you are in Kentucky and you are looking to get a bottle of that, they're going to release it on September 5th before a wider nationwide release in mid-September. They haven't announced the number of bottles, but we do know a little bit more about the blend. So 74% of it is an 11-year-old bourbon, 10% is the 13-year-old, and 16% is the 14-year-old bourbon. They say that the whiskey is rich and balanced and drinks more easily than its proof might suggest and settles into a refined finish. So the reason that this is some of the oldest Maker's Mark we've ever seen is because the cellar age process does kind of limit some of the oak impact on the bourbon. If we had like a 14-year-old Maker's Mark that was sitting in the rickhouses, they're saying that, that could lead to astringency or bitterness. We've seen that before with some older bourbons. Older doesn't always mean better. And I imagine they've probably done some experimenting with older Maker's Mark, and they didn't really find it up to par to release it at that age. But moving it into these cellars, they could kind of round it out, give it a little more age without that massive, heat influence from the rickhouses. So that's really exciting. I would love a chance to try this release. If you guys get a hand on it, let me know, especially if you can compare it to the previous releases. Like I said, I had a sample of the 2023 one, I believe. Didn't get a chance to do it side by side with any other Maker's Mark releases, but I do remember really, really enjoying that. So I will definitely be keeping an eye out for this bottle. Pricing on it is going to be $175, which is steep, but I think for a very well-aged Maker's Mark, that's a pretty fair price. I think if you can get it close to retail, it's definitely worth trying, especially if you're a Maker's Mark fan and you like their high-age, high-proof releases. All right, well, I'll keep the ball rolling with new releases. High West Distillery out of Park City, Utah, just announced their first bottled in bond bourbon that's been distilled exclusively at their distillery in Utah. So High West is mostly known for their rye whiskey. They previously released a bottled in bond rye, but this is their first bottled in bond bourbon that they've had that's, made at their distillery. They used to source a lot from MGP when they were first getting started. They're, like I said, mostly a rye distillery. When I went to do the tour, that's basically all we talked about was the rye. The bourbon was something that they were, I felt like more of like an experimental thing for them, but rye is where they excelled at. So I'm really curious to see how this bourbon is. My experience with their bourbon is relatively limited. Mostly their rye is what I gravitate towards. But like I said, today's review, we're going to review their Bourye, which is a blend of straight whiskeys. Now, it's not all distilled at their distillery. We'll get into the mash bill and all that. But this is a pretty exciting release. It's going to sell for $80. It's available for pre-sale now on their website. It's supposed to ship mid to late August. So either like very, very soon, maybe by the time this podcast comes out, they'll be available. The mash bill is 36% rye and 64% non-GMO yellow corn. So there's no malted barley in this bourbon, which is interesting. They just stuck with a corn and rye mash bill. This has been aged for 4 years and 5 months, and it's bottled at 100 proof, as are all bottled in bond bourbons and ryes. So not only is it going to be available on their website at the distillery, but it's also going to go nationwide for a suggested retail price of $79.99. It's something I'd be interested in trying. Their bourbon's not really what they're known for, but doesn't mean they can't make a good spirit. But congrats to them for having a bottled in bond bourbon that they've distilled themselves. That's not something I expected to see out of High West, at least this soon, with their focus being so much on rye whiskey. But good for them. All right, last piece of new whiskey news comes to us from Penelope Bourbon. They just announced their 2025 Estate Collection, which is a highly anticipated collection showcasing higher age statements, new innovation, and increased allocation across each release. So this year they're having 5 different expressions with minimum age statements of 10 years old. It includes a reimagined Founders Reserve Kentucky Straight Bourbon Whiskey, the introduction of new Omega Straight Bourbon Whiskey finished in Omega French Oak barrels, and the award-winning Single Barrel and Private Select bourbons. So they released the Penelope Estate Collection last year and ended up winning a ton of awards. So I'm excited to see what they have to bring to the table this year. I think one of the highlights is the Founders Reserve 13-year-old Kentucky Straight Bourbon Whiskey that they have. Suggested retail of $199.99. It is a mash bill of 78% corn, 10% rye, and 12% malted barley, aged for 13 years and bottled at cask strength at 121.4 proof. Now, interestingly enough, this is a Kentucky bourbon, so I would imagine this is probably sourced from one of the legacy distilleries, because most of what Penelope does is out of Indiana. So it's exciting to see some Kentucky bourbon in the mix this year. Now, like I said, they're also introducing a new addition to the lineup, which is an Omega 11-year straight bourbon whiskey. And this kind of feels like an evolution of their Architect series. They're working with the same cooperage that's known for their oak scan technology, which scientifically selects staves with the exact chemical composition needed to achieve the desired flavor profile. If you've been following these releases, they have like the oak scan on the back of the bottle. But this one is using their Omega barrels, which are considered the pinnacle of French oak innovation. They say this is crafted with rare, tight-grained oak and meticulously designed toast profile. Of course, starting with the 11-year-old distillate and then putting it into these finishing casks, you're adding even more depth and nuances to that bourbon. The mash bill in this one is going to be 78% corn, 10% rye, and 12% malted barley, and it's going to be bottled at 109.8 proof. These are going to come in at $129.99. There's going to be a limited allocation of 1,800 cases of 750 milliliter bottles and available in select markets starting in September. Now, this next one's interesting. They're having 2 different releases of their single barrel 10-year bourbon, both of which are going to be going for $89.99 retail. The first of which is a mash bill of 75% corn, 21% rye, and 4% malted barley, bottled at 99 proof. The second of which is going to be a mash bill of 60% corn, 36% rye, and 4% malted barley, bottled at 103 proof. So there's a bit of a lower rye bourbon and a higher rye bourbon, both at different proof points, but same price point. They say that these hand-selected barrels showcase the nuanced complexity of the finest stock of well-aged bourbon, and deemed too exceptional to blend. So exciting to see two different releases of that. I love both of those mash bills from Indiana. Curious to see that they are bottled at lower proof than cask strength. I'm wondering what that decision was for. Was it to get more of the bottles, or was it just because they felt like they excelled at those proof points? Would be curious to try those, though. Sound very, very interesting. And lastly is the Private Select 10-year bourbon at $79.99 retail. This is also aged 10 years. It has a mash bill of 74% corn, 20% rye, 1% wheat, and 5% malted barley. Now, even though this is called Private Select, it is a blended bourbon, so that's what sets it apart from those single barrels we saw earlier. This one is bottled at 106.8 proof. Now, according to Michael Palladini, who is the founder of Penelope Bourbon and vice president of strategy of MGP Ingredients, he says that this year's collection is their most exciting and accessible yet. It's going to be available this September in select markets, with first access to the entire collection exclusively at Lux Row Distillers beginning on Friday, September 5th at 9 a.m. EST. They also have a product located on their website if you want to look for it outside of the area. Now, I leave it to you fine folks to decide if you're in the area to go to pick up either these releases or the Maker's Mark Cellar Aged. Both are coming out on the same day, so you can maybe make a whole day of it. Maybe I would probably start out at Maker's Mark. I don't know what time they're opening, but yeah, I imagine those Cellar Aged releases are going to go fast, and then make your way over to Lux Row to get this one. But it should be a fun day to do some bourbon hunting. I wish I could make it out there. All right, well, that does it for our news this week. No video game news. I know there's a Nintendo Direct supposedly rumored to be coming out in September, so we'll have lots of new updates then. But I think it's time for us to move into our bite-sized review. All right. Well, earlier in the podcast, we talked about High West's new bottled and bond bourbon. So I thought the closest thing I had to it was this brand new 2025 release of their Bourye. Now, when I saw this at my local grocery store, I was a bit confused because I thought that they had changed Bourye to being a distillery-only release. Turns out that was a temporary decision because the 2025 release is back available nationally. So definitely picked this up when I saw it. If you're not familiar with Bourye, it is a blend of straight whiskeys. Bourye comes from the name bourbon and rye. And this one is a blend of several. It's marrying 2 straight rye whiskey mash bills with 3 straight bourbon whiskey mash bills. So this is going to be a mouthful, but let me go for it. So of the 5, the first is a 95.5 rye from MGP. The second is an 80% rye, 20% malted rye from High West Distillery. Next up is another MGP mash bill of 75% corn, 21% rye, and 4% barley, followed by another MGP mash bill of 60% corn, 36% rye, and 4% malted barley. And lastly, a 78% corn, 10% rye, 12% malted barley from an undisclosed Kentucky distillery. Now, doing a quick Google search shows that to be a Heaven Hill mash bill, particularly the one used for Elijah Craig. So, not to confirm or deny, but that does seem to be where that whiskey is sourced from. Now, what's interesting is that all of these components have been aged for a minimum of 10 years old in new charred white American oak barrels before being blended and bottled without chill filtration and bottled at 92 proof. So that means the High West distillate in here, the 80% rye, 20% malted rye, is at least 10 years old. That's got to be some of their oldest stuff I've ever seen them, put out. That's pretty cool. And of course, we love some high-aged MGP. And 10 years from Heaven Hill, nothing to scoff at as well. Retail on this bottle is $124.99. I think I paid about that. Maybe a little bit more. It was a Gelson, so a little bit higher end of a grocery store, but I knew I wouldn't pass up the opportunity to give it a try for close to retail, especially because I was very confused, which led me to finding out that they are no longer distillery only. So I picked up a bottle, so let's go ahead and open up and see how it tastes. So there is a batch number on my bottle. It does say batch 25A28. Not sure how many batches of this, but just want to give that in case you had the same bottle. But this is indeed a 2025 version of Bourye. All right, let's go ahead and give this Bourye a nose. Oh, that's beautiful. Wow. Not really what I expected. It kind of has like a menthol kind of note, kind of similar to like a Vicks Vapor Rub. I don't mean that in a bad way, but wasn't expecting that to be the first thing I got on the nose here. But that is followed by a sweet fruitiness, almost like cherry. Very, very bright on the nose. Wow. I mean, I don't know what I expected a Bourye to smell like, but that's definitely not it. Once I've kind of gotten more into it, the menthol kind of goes away a little bit. It still does read really herbaceous and bright. I'm getting almost an apple note to it now, but like a freshly sliced green apple. Not a, apple pie or anything, but just really crisp apples. That cherry's still there, but it's kind of reading more of like a candied cherry, almost like the filling of like a chocolate covered cherry. I don't know if I'm getting as much of the chocolate of it though, just the cherry and the sugar filling. Really beautiful though. I could see this being made into a candle. I think it would be a great holiday candle. The menthol is still there, and sometimes I feel like that could come across as a bit medicinal, especially with blended with the cherry. But to me, it's coming across more of a very light, delicate, bright, fruity dessert. All right, I've been intrigued by this nose for far long enough. I'm gonna go in for a taste. Cheers. Mmm. Oh, wow. Definitely a different experience than the nose. It's still fruity, but it kind of goes a little more citrus on the palate. And the oak is showing up as well, but it's not the typical oak you would expect for something so old. It's definitely more of like a cedar chest kind of note of oak. It's got that like antique kind of dusty quality to it. Let me go in for a second taste of that because that was interesting. Wow. Yeah, I mean, completely unexpected. There's a very specific thing that comes to mind when I taste this, and it's sometimes when I go to a really nice cocktail bar or whiskey bar and I get an old fashioned, they have the orange slice, but they put in the cloves into the orange slice and they do a bit of a char on it. And then they put that into the old fashioned. To me, it's kind of like a culmination of those flavors. The bitter orange peel note, but combined with that clove and that like little bit of char. It's really, really nice. I think this in a cocktail would be fantastic. I mean, it's nothing like I expected, especially seeing that everything's 10 years old. It's not that it doesn't have that depth of character. It does. It just is expressing itself very differently than I expected. Normally, I expected it to be super oak forward, a bit tannic, and, or even some really like saturated oaky notes, kind of like a Jim Beam product. But this is bright, it's fruity, it's refined, and it does taste like a limited edition release. I always say certain whiskeys have a LE note, and this is exactly what I'm talking about. This is unique. This is unlike anything I've had before, and I dig it. I will say the only, I guess, downfall is with the finish. Since it's so bright and fruit forward, the finish doesn't really linger in a way that I kind of expected it to be with it being so old. It's kind of a short to medium finish, but it does leave you with a nice spice note. I think it's like that clove and orange combo that I was getting earlier. And it does leave you with a bit of a coated mouth. Like I do feel the oil is still kind of lingering. Even though the finish is gone, it's still kind of leaving some of those lingering elements just covering my palate. How interesting. This is a unique one, especially when I go into like my overall thoughts and score and recommendation. I will say price-wise, $124.99 retail is a bit up there, but this is a unique experience. It's something I've never really had before. It's very different from what their other LEs are, like a Midwinter's Night Dram, which is one of my favorite bottles. Still brings in a lot of similar elements, but it's expressing itself way differently here. I think it's worth a buy for the price if you're a fan of High West flavor profiles. I don't necessarily see myself picking up a second bottle of it. Maybe next year's release, though, for sure. I'd be curious to see how this evolves over time. So this is one I would say to grab one, see how you like it, and if you absolutely love it, go out, buy more. But if you're like me and you feel like it's delicious, it's great, but not something for you every day, maybe wait till each year's release. Scoring this one, I mean, this is really nice and unique. I think I'll have to give this one a 8 out of 10 for my score. I've been trying to do scores more often now, especially when I'm doing the written reviews of these on Reddit, which I've started posting more recently now. Sometimes it's an easy way to kind of quickly gauge if something is worth buying. For me, this is an 8 out of 10 because it's so unique. It's something I've never had before. It's not that crazy of a price. It's not that hard to find. At least it wasn't in my area. Even though that can be seen as a really high rating, I think it's, on par with what I expect some limited edition bourbons to be. I want them to be unique. I want them to be something I've never experienced before, or at least have some qualities that I associate with being, either well aged, well blended, or just a damn good whiskey. And this checks a lot of those boxes. So yeah, that's my thoughts on High West Bourye for 2025. I like it. I'm surprised by it. I am bewildered, should I say. But definitely going to keep an eye out for these in the future. I'm curious to see how it compares to other batches. All right, well, thank you guys so much again for listening. As always, feel free to leave me your comments and thoughts of the podcast. You can email me, contact@bourbonbytes.com, send me a message on social media @bourbonbytes, or give me a call at 916-64-BYTES. That's 916-642-9837. Leave me a voicemail with your questions or suggestions or comments, and I will feature them on next week's show if you want me to. Or if you want to keep it private, just let me know, and I'll keep it between us. I'll talk to you guys next week. This has been the Bourbon Bytes podcast, a whiskey podcast with a gaming twist. Cheers, and I'll talk to you guys next episode. Bye.